The morning mist lay across Paris like a silk scarf draped carelessly over the shoulders of a woman who had not yet decided whether to rise or simply stay wrapped in her dreams. The cobblestone streets, slick with dew, seemed to sigh under the soft weight of the dawn. And above it all, the great city breathed in that slow, knowing way it always did, half asleep, half listening, as if the air itself was waiting for something curious to be said. Down a quiet street, just off Rue Saint-Honoré, stood a little café that had seen more years than it cared to count. Its wooden sign creaked gently in the breeze, the faded paint spelling out Café de l'Echo. True to its name, it was the kind of place where voices lingered long after the words were spoken. Inside, the world seemed smaller, cozier. The heavy velvet curtains were still drawn against the morning chill, and the faint glow of a single gas lamp cast a soft halo over a corner table. It was here that a woman sat alone, her gloved fingers curled delicately around a porcelain cup. She wore a long flowing skirt of deep burgundy wool, its hem brushing gently against her boots. A silk scarf was wrapped twice around her slender neck, and from beneath her modest hat, a few unruly strands of chestnut hair had managed to escape. Her name was Isabel, though names on mornings like this seemed far less important than the simple comfort of warm coffee and quiet solitude. And then, just as the first hint of sunlight attempted to press through the fogged window, a voice broke the hush. "Madame," it said, with a kind of mischief hidden beneath its politeness, "do you realize you have narrowly escaped becoming a criminal this morning?" The voice belonged to Henri, the cafe's owner and self-appointed guardian of every ridiculous law Paris had ever invented. His mustache, thick and dramatically curled at the ends, seemed almost to twitch with amusement as he stood polishing a glass behind the counter. Isabel looked up, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "A criminal," she echoed softly, her voice barely louder than the steam that rose gently from her cup. "Surely, Monsieur Henri, you don't mean me?" Henri leaned forward, elbows resting theatrically on the counter, as though preparing to deliver some grand, forbidden secret. "Oh, but I do mean you, madame," he whispered, lowering his voice, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Had you chosen this morning to wear a pair of trousers instead of that most elegant skirt, well, I'm afraid you would have found yourself in direct violation of the law." Isabel let out a small, incredulous laugh, shaking her head, as if brushing away the nonsense of it all. "Surely you jest?" But Henri only smiled in that particularly Parisian way, a smile that knew things better, left unsaid, that had seen too many seasons of absurdity to be surprised by even the strangest truths. "Ah, but you see, madame," he said, swirling the cloth around the glass, "it is no jest. There is indeed a law still perfectly valid that forbids women in this fine city from wearing trousers unless they have obtained, how shall we say, a most particular permission from the local prefecture." The cafe seemed to grow quieter then, as if even the old walls leaned in closer to hear the rest. Isabel raised her cup slowly, her eyes never leaving Henri's. "And tell me," she asked, her voice warm, despite the chill outside, "has anyone ever truly enforced such a thing?" Henri chuckled low and long, a sound like old paper turning its final page. Perhaps once, perhaps twice. But as with many things in Paris, it is not the enforcement that matters. It is the existence of the rule itself, a rule so quietly ridiculous, it becomes part of the city's charm, a forgotten corner of history, tucked away like an old love letter in a locked drawer. Outside, the fog began to lift, and for a moment, the distant silhouette of the Eiffel Tower stood faint against the pale morning sky. Tell me, Monsieur Henri Isabelle mused, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Why would such a law exist at all? Henri's mustache twitched once more as he offered a shrug that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Ah, but that, madame, is the question that will take us a most curious journey to answer. And so, dear listener, perhaps you too are now wondering, how could it be that in a city known for its revolutions, its grand ideas of liberty and equality, a woman could not simply wear a pair of trousers? Settle in. Let the soft rustle of fabric and the muted echoes of footsteps on cobblestones guide you back through the winding alleyways of time. For tonight, we'll wander slowly through a Paris. Most have forgotten a Paris where fashion was more than mere appearance, where a single piece of clothing held the quiet power to challenge authority, defy propriety, and perhaps even shape the course of history. And so, with a sip of warm coffee and a heart full of wonder, we take our first step into this most peculiar of Parisian tales. The year was 1799, and Paris stood at the uneasy crossroads between the smoke of revolution and the dawn of something uncertain. The cobblestones still bore the echoes of marching boots and the memory of guillotines that had worked overtime under a sky often too gray for comfort. Yet, amidst the rubble of broken monarchies and shredded banners of the old world, a new fear took root, one that no blade could cut cleanly, no decree could fully suppress. It was the fear of women, not the delicate women immortalized in marble or painted reclining on velvet lounges. No, this fear was of a different kind of women, who stood tall in the public squares, who clenched their fists as fiercely as any man, and who most dangerously of all began to ask the kind of questions that made powerful men glance nervously over their shoulder. You see, in the final years of the 18th century, a woman in trousers wasn't merely a matter of fashion, it was a symbol. And symbols, as history has shown time and time again, can topple empires. In the months leading up to the winter of 1799, Paris had witnessed something extraordinary. Bands of women, strong, resolute, often from the working class, had taken to the streets not in billowing skirts, but in garments that scandalized the very foundation of polite society. They wore trousers, not for fashion, not for vanity, but for purpose. Some marched alongside the Revolutionary Guards, others worked the docks and warehouses where men once stood before the wars drained the city of its able-bodied sons, and still more, simply wore them because they could. But not everyone saw bravery in this simple act of fabric and defiance. The ruling powers, their nerves frayed thin by years of upheaval, saw something far more dangerous. To them, these women in trousers were not citizens embracing freedom. They were radicals, subversives, agents of chaos in a society already teetering on the brink. And so, on November 17th of that same year, a law was quietly drafted, a peculiar and pointed decree known formally as Arrêté du Préfet de Police. Its language was as crisp as a freshly pressed uniform. Women are prohibited from dressing in the style of men unless given authorization by the local police prefecture. This permission must be renewed at regular intervals and is to be granted only under exceptional circumstances. Exceptional circumstances, they said. One might wonder what qualified as exceptional in the eyes of the French prefecture. Was it the bitter cold that forced working women to don practical attire while hauling sacks of grain across icy courtyards? Or the mud-slicked alleyways that made long skirts little more than soggy burdens? Or perhaps it was the reality that a woman with her legs clothed and her steps unhindered might simply walk faster, stand firmer, and reach further than society thought appropriate. Of course, on the surface, the decree was framed as a matter of public order, a way to prevent improper confusion between the sexes. But beneath its tailored phrasing, the stitching of fear was unmistakable. This was not about fabric. It was about control. The very idea that a woman might blur the lines of gendered expectation was unsettling enough. But when paired with the image of her stepping confidently into spaces once reserved for men, city halls, factories, public forums, the panic became palpable. And yet, as with so many attempts to legislate propriety, the law itself became something of a quiet absurdity. Few women formally applied for permission to wear trousers. Even fewer were granted it. But did that stop them? Paris has always had a way of smiling politely at its own rules before promptly ignoring them. Behind shuttered windows and along narrow passageways, women adapted. They wore practical trousers beneath their voluminous skirts, hidden layers against the bitter chill. In the marketplaces, one could spot them, aprons dusted with flower sleeves rolled to the elbow, and just beneath the hem of a skirt, the unmistakable flash of sturdy boots and a hint of forbidden cloth. If the prefects noticed, they turned a blind eye. Perhaps they too had mothers, sisters, wives, who preferred to keep their legs warm rather than honor an outdated fear. But the law remained. A quiet shadow stitched into the very fabric of Parisian life. A reminder that even as revolutions claimed to bring liberty, even as banners of liberté, égalité, fraternité fluttered above city squares, freedom for some was always a little more complicated. So, dear listener, imagine with me a winter morning in 1799. A young girl named Lucienne stands before her mother's cracked mirror. Her fingers fumble nervously with the worn buttons of her late father's old trousers. Outside, the streets are slick with ice, and the bakery where she works is 3 long blocks away. She takes a deep breath, tucks the hems neatly into her boots, and pulls her long coat tightly around her waist. In that moment, Lucienne is no revolutionary, no great leader of movements or ideas. She is simply practical, but in the quiet defiance of her choice, she carries the weight of something much larger than herself. And so it was that with each careful step through the icy streets, a quiet revolution continued, not with speeches or banners, but with each silent, determined stride in a forbidden pair of trousers. The chill of a Parisian winter in the early 1800s had a particular way of settling into one's bones. It crept under doors, slid through cracks in stone walls, and lingered beneath the cobblestones, turning every street into a river of frost. But there were some women who walked those icy streets with a certain defiance, heads held a little higher, footsteps a little firmer, and beneath their long skirts, secrets wrapped in wool and courage. They were not revolutionaries in the grand sense of the word. No fiery speeches from balconies or grand pronouncements in crowded halls. These women fought their quiet battles with each step they took, against the biting cold, against the rigid laws, and against a society that seemed determined to keep them shivering, struggling, and silent. It began with the most practical of reasons. On a particularly bitter morning, a young laundress named Colette Marchand found herself standing before the iron gates of the Hôtel de Ville, her breath fogging the air, her skirts soaked through from the slush of the streets. She had work to deliver linen pressed and folded with aching hands, but the cold had left her trembling so violently that she could barely stand. Looking down at the sorry state of her soaked stockings and numb feet, she made a decision. The next day, Colette appeared again before the Hôtel de Ville, but this time beneath her skirt, she wore her brother's old woolen trousers. She tucked the hems into a pair of battered leather boots, cinched a thick belt around her waist beneath the folds of her skirt, and for the first time in weeks, she walked with warmth in her legs and a quiet smile on her lips. Of course, it didn't take long for word to spread. "Have you heard about Colette?" The market women whispered between stalls of winter apples and wilted greens. "She's hiding trousers under that skirt of hers, and she walks like she owns the streets." In the crowded laundries and kitchens, in the dark corners of seamstresses' workshops, a silent understanding passed from woman to woman. Practicality was no crime, and if it was, well, it was a crime worth committing. But there were others more daring still, who didn't bother to hide behind long skirts. One such figure was Madame Renée Dufour, a widow of no great wealth but considerable spirit. Known throughout her neighborhood for her sharp tongue and sharper sense of humor, she had long since tired of tiptoeing through muddy streets while her hems dragged behind her like soggy regrets. One crisp afternoon, with the sand glinting like liquid silver under a pale sun, Renée fastened the last button of her late husband's riding trousers, pulled on his weathered boots, and stepped out onto Rue de Rivoli with all the grace and dignity of a queen surveying her realm. Gasps followed her every step. "Mon Dieu, is she mad?" someone whispered. "Or perhaps simply tired of being cold," came the quiet reply. Children stared in wide-eyed wonder. Some men laughed behind gloved hands, but Madame Renée Shea walked on chin, lifted high, a small smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. By the time she reached the cafe at the corner, she had already become a legend. And as she sat by the window, legs crossed in plain sight, sipping her steaming coffee, she glanced out at the gathering crowd and thought, not without satisfaction, how terribly fragile society could be, that a single pair of trousers could stir it into such a frenzy. And yet, for all their boldness, these women were not seeking to overthrow the order of things. They were seeking warmth, comfort, freedom not in manifestos and barricades, but in the simple right to walk their own streets without suffering the cold indignities of damp skirts and frozen feet. But history, as it often does, has a way of turning small acts of defiance into symbols of something much greater. The image of women striding confidently through the snow-dusted streets of Paris in sturdy boots and forbidden trousers took root in the public imagination. Some saw scandal, others saw liberation, and a few those who feared the shifting tides of power saw danger. Because if a woman could choose what to wear, what else might she choose? So the whispers grew louder. First the trousers, and next the right to vote. First boots, and then boardrooms. It seemed a ridiculous leap at the time, and yet in hindsight, perhaps it wasn't so ridiculous after all. For every Colette who tucked her brother's trousers beneath her skirt, and every Madame Renee who strutted proudly through the boulevards in plain view, the fabric of society stretched a little thinner and a little closer to change. And so, as the frost gave way to early spring and the streets of Paris stirred once more with the sound of markets reopening and cafes buzzing with fresh gossip, the question lingered in the air, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. If a woman could wear trousers and walk the streets unashamed, what might she do next? Spring came reluctantly to Paris that year, as if the city itself wasn't quite sure it had permission to bloom again. The air grew warmer. The chestnut trees along the boulevards stretched out their pale green fingers. And yet beneath the gentle thaw, the cold undercurrents of tradition held fast. And nowhere did that icy grip feel tighter than in the gilded salons of Parisian high society, where the grand dames and couturiers gathered their voices soft as silk, and their judgments sharp as tailors' shears. For in the rarefied world of haute couture, change did not come easily. It arrived, if it arrived at all, wrapped in the most delicate of fabrics, hemmed with caution, and always, always approved by those who decided what was tasteful and what was simply vulgar. In 1800s, Paris fashion wasn't just clothing. It was law, and in the unwritten commandments of Parisian elegance, skirts were not merely garments. They were symbols of virtue, of class, of the carefully constructed distance between proper ladies and the untamed chaos of the world beyond their drawing rooms. The great fashion houses presided over by men with immaculate gloves, and women who never walked without a lady's maid, 2 steps behind, declared it so. Trousers, one could almost hear Monsieur Etienne Bellamy, the famed couturier of the Rue de la Paix, scoff behind a velvet curtain. My dear trousers are for laborers, for soldiers, for men, not for ladies who carry the grace of France in their every step. And indeed, to the eyes of high society, the very idea of a woman choosing practicality over presentation was something close to heresy. Ladies were to glide, not stride, to float across polished marble floors, their skirts whispering like gentle breezes in spring gardens, not to march through the streets in boots and tailored pants. At the grand Salon de la Mode, where each season's latest styles were unveiled with the solemnity of a royal decree, the idea of incorporating trousers into a lady's wardrobe was met with horrified gasps, and the faint scent of lavender-scented salts being pressed to pale foreheads. Imagine the chaos. One duchess was said to have murmured, her gloved hand trembling as she adjusted her pearl necklace. If women dress like men, what will become of the natural order? It was a sentiment echoed endlessly in the gilded parlors and perfumed gatherings of the time. Yet beneath the rustle of silk and the delicate clink of porcelain teacups, there was something else, something stirring, a quiet discomfort, because even as they clung to their crinolines and corsets, even as their feet ached from the pointed shoes designed more for beauty than balance, some of these very women behind closed doors wondered what it might feel like to simply walk freely, to stretch one's legs without the weight of layers upon layers of fabric, to stand firm and unencumbered on both feet, without swaying under the delicate tyranny of fashion. But appearances, as they say in Paris, are everything. And so, while working-class women tucked trousers under their skirts for warmth, and the bold few strutted openly through the markets and along the docks, the upper classes held the line. For them, the skirt was not merely a garment. It was a fortress, a barrier between their world and the wild winds of change that howled just outside their salon doors. And high fashion stood guard at those gates, armed not with swords, but with stitching and silk, with the power to declare at a single turn of the season that some things were simply not done. But even the grandest fortresses crumble not with sudden sieges, but under the quiet, relentless pressure of time. And as the decades drifted by, as the cobbled streets saw more and more women choosing comfort over convention, the skirts, those grand banners of femininity, grew a little lighter, a little shorter. And high fashion, well, for now, it pretended not to notice. But in the hidden corners of Paris, in the quiet hours just before dawn, one might catch a glimpse of a seamstress running her fingers over a new pattern. A faint outline of something daring. A trouser leg, narrow at the ankle, elegant at the waist, waiting, just waiting, for the right moment to step out of the shadows and into the sunlight. Winter has a way of stripping away pretense, doesn't it? It makes no distinction between the grand avenues of the wealthy and the crooked alleys of the poor. Cold slips through every doorway, finds its way under the finest embroidered skirts and the most tattered woolen shawls alike. And in Paris, when the frost came, it came with a quiet cruelty, settling into the Seine like a sheet of dull silver, and biting at every exposed ankle that dared cross its bridges. In such winters, practicality often whispers louder than propriety. And it was during these frost-laden months that Parisian women, regardless of status, learned the art of hidden rebellion. They called them les pantalons discrets, the discreet trousers. Hidden under layers of fabric, these simple garments became silent companions through the coldest days. You would not see them in the grand salons or beneath the dazzling chandeliers of the Palais Garnier. No, they lived out their quiet existence beneath heavy skirts and petticoats, warming legs that society demanded remain both unseen and encumbered. In the working-class quarters of Montmartre and Belleville, the practice was almost a necessity. Young girls like Emily Dupont, barely 14, and already spending her days carrying baskets of coal through the snow-drifted streets, would rise before dawn. By the pale light of a single candle, she would slip on a pair of coarse woolen trousers cut down from an old pair belonging to her father. Over them, she'd layer her skirt worn thin, but still long enough to hide her small act of defiance. Outside, the city would groan beneath the weight of another bitter morning. And as Emily trudged through the icy slush, her legs, at least, were spared the sting of winter's sharp tongue. But it wasn't just the working poor who embraced this secret rebellion. Even behind the tall, ornate gates of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, among the ladies who paraded through society in their carriages and silk-lined cloaks, the hidden trousers found their place. Take, for instance, Madame Clarice de Valois, a baroness of no small reputation. To the world, she was the perfect image of refinement, her skirts sweeping elegantly across marble floors, her every step measured graceful and in full accordance with Parisian decorum. But those close to her knew a different story. On the coldest days, when the stone floors of her grand estate seemed to radiate frost, and the endless social calls required her to brave the frigid streets, Madame Clarice would instruct her maid to lay out a pair of finely tailored woolen trousers fashioned discreetly by a trusted dressmaker. They were never to be seen, of course, but they were there, always there, hidden beneath layers of silk and velvet, a warm reminder that even those bound most tightly by society's expectations found ways to slip free, if only in small, invisible rebellions. It became almost a private joke among the women of her circle, a knowing glance exchanged over tea, a slight nod when boots disappeared beneath the folds of a skirt. "How scandalous," one would murmur with a smile. "How delightfully practical," another would reply, eyes twinkling above her porcelain cup. And so beneath the grand architecture and the frigid skies, a quiet warmth spread through the city, not from roaring hearths or thick blankets, but from a shared understanding that sometimes survival meant bending the rules in the gentlest of ways. Of course, the law remained. Officially, a woman wearing trousers in public was in violation of the 1799 decree. But who could enforce such a rule against that which could not be seen? The city's prefects and constables had more pressing matters than chasing after phantom trousers hidden beneath respectable skirts. And in their own homes, perhaps their wives and daughters were partaking in the very same small rebellions. It was, after all, Paris, a city that thrived on appearances, but always held a secret or two, just beneath the surface. As winters came and went, the practice continued. Generation after generation, young girls grew into women who remembered the lessons whispered by their mothers and grandmothers. "Stay warm, my dear, and if the world won't give you permission, take it quietly for yourself." And so beneath every swirling gust of snow, every icy breeze that howled through the narrow alleys of the Marais, and along the wide boulevards of Haussmann's grand designs, there walked an army of women wrapped in propriety, yes, but shielded by warmth, and bound by a silent, knowing courage. They never marched, they never shouted, but with every hidden step, every silent stride through the frost, they carried forward a quiet revolution. One that began, as so many great changes do, with nothing more than a bit of fabric, and the simple refusal to suffer in silence. If Paris was the stage upon which history's grand dramas unfolded, then Sarah Bernhardt was the brightest star to ever grace its boards. By the late 19th century, Sarah wasn't merely an actress. She was an institution, a legend, a living, breathing force of nature wrapped in silk and scandal. They called her La Divine, and rightly so, for no woman before, or perhaps since, could command both a theater and a city with nothing more than the raise of an eyebrow and the measured turn of her wrist. Yet it wasn't her voice alone that stirred the hearts of Parisians. It was her boldness, her refusal to play by the fragile rules of femininity, so carefully written by men in smoke-filled chambers and echoed in the salons of high society. And nowhere was that defiance more sharply displayed than in the day she chose to wear trousers, not on stage as part of some dramatic costume, but out in the open, under the pale Parisian sun, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when it happened. The air smelled faintly of burnt chestnuts and the damp promise of approaching winter. Along the Champs-Élysées, the fashionable elite strolled beneath the golden leaves, their skirts trailing like the long shadows cast by the afternoon light. And then from the end of the boulevard came the unmistakable figure of Sarah Bernhardt. But she was not draped in the expected cascade of lace and velvet. She wore instead a sharply tailored velvet jacket cut perfectly to her slender waist, and beneath it a pair of fitted trousers, dark as the night, and scandalously revealing the confident stride of her long legs. She wore them not in apology, but in triumph. On her head sat a tilted hat with a feather that seemed to defy gravity, and in her gloved hand she carried a slender walking cane, not for support, but as a subtle declaration of power. Gasps rippled through the crowds like wind through autumn leaves. Mon Dieu, is that Sarah Bernhardt? In trousers, publicly, women clutched at their pearl necklaces. Gentlemen fumbled with their hat brims, unsure whether to tip them or shield their eyes. But Sarah walked as if she were cutting through a sea of fog, untouched, untouchable, and utterly unconcerned. For her, this was no stunt. It was a statement. She had long understood that a costume did not simply cover the body, it revealed the soul. And in that moment, dressed in attire forbidden by a law that had quietly gathered dust for nearly a century, Sarah Bernhardt declared that she belonged to no one's definition of what a woman should be. Of course, the newspapers the next day were aflame with outrage and fascination. Has La Divine finally gone too far? One headline cried. The trouser scandal on the Grand Boulevard proclaimed another. But amid all the ink spilled in disapproval, there was something else. Something quieter but far more dangerous to the old guard admiration. Young women spoke in hushed excitement about her daring. Seamstresses began to sketch their own versions of the rebellious ensemble. And in the smoky cafes of Montparnasse, poets and artists toasted to her audacity. Sarah herself, when asked by a rather severe journalist why she had chosen to don such scandalous attire, is said to have leaned back in her chair, eyes sparkling with wicked amusement, and answered simply, "Why, monsieur, I find it easier to breathe when my legs are not in prison." And that perhaps was the heart of it all. For decades, society had wrapped women in layer upon layer of expectation, tight corsets to hold in their waists, long skirts to trip their steps, and rules, always more rules to keep them quiet and contained. But Sarah Bernhardt, with one afternoon stroll in tailored trousers, reminded the world that freedom doesn't always arrive with banners and trumpets. Sometimes it comes quietly, with the swish of velvet and the soft click of a well-heeled boot against the pavement. She did not set out to topple governments or rewrite laws. She simply lived boldly, unapologetically, and entirely on her own terms. And in doing so, she became a symbol far more powerful than any decree or doctrine. Because if Sarah Bernhardt La Divine herself could walk the grandest avenue in Paris, wearing trousers, and leave the city breathless in her wake, well, who was to say what other impossibilities might be possible after all? History has a peculiar sense of timing. It waits, it hesitates, and then, with a sudden, undeniable force, it sweeps away centuries of quiet resistance in a single, unavoidable tide. For Parisian women, that tide came not with fashion designers or actresses, but with the low, relentless hum of war drums. The year was 1914. The world teetered on the edge of a storm, unlike anything it had ever known. And when that storm broke, when the Great War consumed Europe in a roar of artillery and sorrow, everything changed, including what a woman was expected to wear. In the early days of the war, Paris tried to pretend that life could continue as it always had. The theaters stayed open. The cafes still poured their bitter coffee into thin porcelain cups. And the women, well, the women still wore their skirts, their lace collars, their delicate hats, tilted at just the right angle. But war is a greedy beast. It demands more than soldiers and supplies. It demands hands. And with so many men gone to the front lines, the quiet hum of factories and the steady pulse of the city's infrastructure faltered. And so the call went out, not for soldiers this time, but for women. To work the shipyards and armament factories, to haul coal and drive streetcars, to farm the fields and run the warehouses. And you cannot swing a hammer or turn a wrench in a silk skirt. So for the first time in Parisian memory, practicality didn't merely whisper, it shouted. Across the city, women rolled up their sleeves and stepped into the roles left vacant by their fathers, brothers, and husbands. And with those new roles came a new necessity: trousers. Not the carefully tailored velvet-lined trousers of Sarah Bernhardt. Not the hidden woolen garments tucked quietly beneath winter skirts. No. These were rough, sturdy work trousers cut from thick canvas or coarse denim, designed not for fashion, but for survival. Women wore them into the factories where the air hung thick with the scent of oil and gunpowder. They wore them into the fields, their boots caked with mud, as they plowed the earth to keep the nation fed. And in doing so, they discovered something: freedom. It was a freedom found not in grand speeches or political manifestos, but in the simple, exhilarating ability to move unhindered and unobserved. With every step they took across the factory floor, every confident stride along the boulevards on their way to work, Parisian women felt something shift deep within them. A skirt could never offer this sense of balance, of strength, of standing firmly on both feet and looking the world directly in the eye. And perhaps for the first time, they realized just how much had been hidden behind the graceful drapery of the past. Of course, not everyone welcomed this change. In the hushed corners of certain salons, the older generations wrung their hands. If this continues, they whispered, what becomes of femininity? What becomes of grace? But out in the real Paris, the Paris of smoke and industry, of hunger and hope, there was little time for such concern. The war demanded everything, and if trousers helped a woman do her work without freezing or tripping over her hemline, then trousers she would wear. By the winter of 1915, it was no longer a rarity to see a woman in trousers driving a tram through the fog or unloading crates at the train stations. In fact, it became so common that the newspapers, once scandalized by the very thought, began publishing practical advice columns titled things like, How to Select the Best Work Trousers for Your War Efforts. And then, just as swiftly as the war had drawn them into this new life, it ended. The soldiers returned. The factories emptied. And Paris, it seemed, expected everything to return to its proper place, including its women. The skirts returned. The corsets were laced tighter. The great fashion houses, having survived the war years with barely concealed disdain for utilitarian attire, resumed their reign. sending waves of silk and tulle back onto the runways. But something had changed. The women had changed. For even as they tied the ribbons at their waists and adjusted their veiled hats deep down, they carried with them the memory of what it felt like to walk freely, to stand solidly in their own space. They had worn trousers and survived. No more than that, they had thrived. And while society might try to pull the fabric of tradition tightly around them, again beneath it all, they knew the world had shifted. And one day, not long from now, that quiet memory would rise again. This time, not out of necessity, but by choice. And then, almost as if history had been holding its breath, for just the right moment, she appeared. Gabrielle Coco Chanel. If Sarah Bernhardt had startled Paris with her theatrical defiance, Coco Chanel would quietly, almost effortlessly dismantle centuries of fashion's ironclad rules with nothing more than a needle, a bolt of jersey fabric, and a vision that felt at the time almost scandalous in its simplicity, that a woman should dress for herself. When Coco Chanel walked the streets of Deauville in the early 1910s, wearing wide-legged trousers, yachting pants, she called them people, didn't quite know what to make of her. It wasn't that she was loud or brash. In fact, she was the opposite. Calm, composed, effortlessly elegant. But it was precisely that calm confidence that unsettled them. She didn't wear trousers as a costume or a political statement. She wore them because they were comfortable, because they allowed her to move with grace and ease, to walk along the windy beaches, with her head held high and her feet steady against the shifting sands. And in that simple act, Chanel planted the quietest, most powerful seed of rebellion Paris had ever seen. She looked at the rigid corsets, the towering hats, the yards and yards of fabric that seemed to drown a woman's very being. And with a graceful flick of her wrist, she swept them aside. Luxury, she would later say, must be comfortable. Otherwise, it is not luxury at all. It was a philosophy as radical as any political manifesto, because beneath the elegance of her designs lay something far more revolutionary: freedom. Freedom to move, freedom to breathe, freedom to live life unencumbered by the weight of tradition. By the 1920s, Chanel had become more than a designer. She was a cultural force, a symbol of modern femininity. Her legendary boutique on Rue Cambon became a sanctuary for women who were tired of playing dress-up for a society that never quite knew what to do with them. And there, among the soft folds of her jersey knits and the sharp, clean lines of her tailored suits, the trouser found its rightful place, not as a hidden garment tucked beneath heavy skirts, not as a desperate necessity of wartime labor, but as a proud, visible choice. She introduced what would become known as the Chanel pajama. Not a garment meant for sleep, but a flowing, elegant set of wide-legged trousers and a matching top, designed to be worn on the Riviera aboard yachts or at the most fashionable seaside resorts. The scandal it caused was predictably immense. Pajamas in public, the critics cried. Trousers for ladies at the grand hotels. But it was too late. The world had already seen what freedom looked like when wrapped in soft fabrics and paired with a string of perfectly knotted pearl. And Paris, though it grumbled and resisted, couldn't help but fall a little in love with this new vision of womanhood. The modern woman Chanel showed them was not defined by the tightness of her corset or the length of her hemline. She was defined by the length of her stride, the strength in her voice, and the calm, undeniable confidence with which she claimed space in a world that had tried for far too long to keep her contained. And so as the 1920s roared to life, you could see it in the streets. On the boulevards and along the sun-drenched promenades, women in flowing trousers walked with their heads high, their eyes forward. The old laws, those yellowed decrees about what a woman could or could not wear, lingered still, of course. But Paris, ever the city of quiet revolutions, had made up its mind. Trousers were no longer a symbol of scandal. They were a symbol of something far more powerful choice. And in the end, isn't that the greatest freedom of all? Not to rebel for the sake of rebellion. Not to wear a garment simply to make a statement, but to wake each morning and choose without fear, without apology, exactly what makes you feel most like yourself. And so, beneath the soft clatter of cafe cups and the distant hum of car engines along the Champs-Élysées, Paris exhaled and took its first true step into the modern age. Not with a roar, but with the quiet, confident click of a woman's heels, echoing proudly above the soft sweep of her trousers. By the time the world stumbled through the chaos of yet another great war, the Paris that emerged in the 1950s was a city both weary and wonderfully rebellious. Its bones ached with memories of conflict, but its spirit, oh, its spirit had found new ways to defy the old world. And nowhere was that defiance more beautifully displayed than in the way its women walked. Not marched, not tiptoed. They walked boldly, confidently along the grand boulevards and narrow cobbled lanes, their steps no longer hidden behind layers of fabric, but free and unashamed in something that seemed almost scandalously simple capri pants. It was as if the women of Paris had collectively decided that elegance and practicality were no longer enemies. And why should they be? The war had taught them resilience. Chanel had taught them grace in simplicity. And now the post-war years offered something deliciously sweet after the long bitterness of survival choice. The capri pant, named after the sun-drenched Italian island, but adopted with enthusiasm by Parisian women, wasn't loud or revolutionary in the way headlines liked to proclaim revolutions. No, it was subtle, quiet, a soft rebellion stitched into a cropped hemline that revealed just enough of the ankle to make conservative brows furrow and young hearts flutter. These pants weren't the heavy utilitarian garments of factory floors. They were light, perfectly tailored, often made from soft cotton or linen, designed to move as effortlessly as the women who wore them. On the left bank, you could see them in the smoky corners of existentialist cafes, where young women sat cross-legged on rickety chairs, discussing philosophy, with a cigarette poised elegantly between two fingers. Their capri pants, paired with striped boat neck tops and ballet flats, became a silent uniform of intellectual freedom and understated rebellion. Across the river on the right bank, it was the artists' muses who took up the trend. They strolled through the Tuileries gardens, a hint of defiance in their narrowed eyes, a soft rustle of fabric brushing against their calves as they walked past statues carved in a time when women were meant only to pose, not to pace with purpose. And in Montmartre, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the faintest traces of spilled absinthe, the capri pant was worn with a playful shrug. Let them talk, the young women seemed to say with a flick of their perfectly tied scarves. They always do. Of course, the old laws, yes, those stubborn words penned back in 1799, still lingered on the books. Technically, legally, a woman in trousers was still in violation. But who in that lively, sun-dappled Paris of the 1950s had the time or the inclination to enforce such nonsense? Even the gendarmerie, with their polished boots and neatly pressed uniforms, had long since turned a blind eye. Perhaps some even found themselves smiling behind their stoic facades as a parade of young women, their capri pants swinging gently above polished shoes, passed them by with the faintest hint of amusement in their eyes. It was, after all, Paris, and Paris has always known that the most lasting revolutions are not shouted from balconies. They are walked quietly down familiar streets. And so the city adjusted as it always does. Tailors began offering patterns for Le Pantalon Court, specifically designed for the modern woman. Fashion magazines, which once condemned anything that dared show an ankle, now published spreads celebrating the effortless chic of cropped trousers paired with soft cardigans and strings of pearls. Even in the grand halls of the fashion houses, some of the old guard began to relent, begrudgingly, admitting that perhaps there was something undeniably Parisian about a woman who could dress simply and still turn every head on the boulevard. By the time the decade drew to a close, capri pants weren't a scandal. They were a statement, a quiet one, yes. But sometimes the quietest statements are the most profound, because they didn't ask for permission. They simply were. And isn't that, in the end, the purest form of freedom? To step out into the world clothed not in expectation, but in ease. To walk the streets of a city that had once forbidden you to dress for your own comfort, and to do so with the kind of grace that silenced every lingering protest. So if you had walked along the Seine one late spring afternoon, just as the sun began to dip low and the river caught fire with its reflection, you might have seen them, a small group of young women, their laughter floating through the air, their steps light and sure, their capri pants swaying just above the cobbled stones. And somewhere far off in the distance, if you listened very closely, you might have heard the faintest sound. Not the clatter of revolution, but the soft, confident footsteps of freedom, measured, graceful, and utterly unstoppable. By the dawn of the 1960s, Paris had all but forgotten the old decree, the ink-faded law that, on fragile parchment, somewhere deep within the archives of the police prefecture, still forbade women from wearing trousers without official permission. Forgotten, but not erased. Like an old crack in the foundation of a grand building, it was there, hidden beneath layers of fresh plaster and new paint, quietly ignored, but structurally present. And as the women of Paris walked the streets in their tailored pantsuits, their crisp capris, and the newly fashionable high-waisted trousers that swept elegantly over polished shoes, few gave that ancient law a second thought. But laws, even the most absurd ones, have a peculiar way of lingering. They remain tucked away in the corners of dusty archives, their pages yellowed, but not yet crumbled to dust. And sometimes they are stumbled upon at the most curious of times. It was during a particularly tedious session of administrative housekeeping, somewhere in the cluttered basement of the Paris police headquarters, that a young civil servant named Etienne Martin stumbled across the document. Tucked neatly between two forgotten ledgers and a stack of old licenses there, it sat. Arrêté du préfet de police, 17 Novembre 1799. His fingers traced the ornate lettering, a slow smile curling at the absurdity of it all. Surely, he thought, this cannot possibly still be in effect. But as his research revealed, the law had never been formally repealed. Revised, yes, once in 1892, and again, faintly and half-heartedly, in 1909, to allow for women on horseback and certain health-related circumstances, but abolished. Never, so technically, if one were to be particularly fastidious about such things, every woman striding confidently down the Champs-Élysées in her sharply tailored trousers was, in the eyes of the law, a walking offense. But the city had changed far too much to care. Even the police themselves, when faced with this revelation, simply laughed. Who among us would dare stop a woman for her fashion choices in this day and age? One officer quipped over a cup of lukewarm coffee. That's a fight no sane man wishes to pick. And so the law remained where it had long been silent, irrelevant, and mostly forgotten. But still, there's something unsettling about a rule that lingers like a ghost, isn't there? Something about its quiet, stubborn existence that suggests the world is never quite as free as it pretends to be. For while no one enforced the law, its presence was a reminder, a faint, uncomfortable echo of a time when control over a woman's body extended even to the fabric that covered her legs. And in that lingering echo was a quiet question. If this law could survive 2 centuries, how many other unseen chains still lay hidden beneath the surface, unexamined and unchallenged? Yet in true Parisian fashion, the women of the city did not pause their strides to contemplate the dusty remnants of such law. They had more important things to do. In the corner cafes of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, young women leaned forward over tiny tables, discussing philosophy and civil rights with cigarettes balanced delicately between their fingers. On the grand avenues, women in striking Yves Saint Laurent pantsuits turned heads as they moved with the grace and confidence of those who had long since outgrown the narrow cages of outdated propriety. And in the shadowed corridors of academia and politics, another quiet revolution was beginning to stir. One that would soon take those forgotten laws, hold them up to the harsh light of modernity, and ask quite simply, why are you still here? But that, dear listener, is a tale for another part of our journey. For now, picture the city as it stood in the twilight of the 20th century, its streets alive with the footsteps of women who no longer asked for permission to take up space, to walk freely, to dress as they pleased. Above them, the lamps of the boulevards cast their golden glow, and somewhere in the distance, the soft strains of an accordion played a tune both sweet and defiantly familiar. And though the law remained hidden in some forgotten drawer, the women of Paris walked on unbothered, unstoppable, and beautifully unaware of the silent, ridiculous offense they committed with every confident step. It happened as these things often do not, with grand declarations or flashing headlines, but in the most ordinary of places, on a quiet, sun-dappled street in the 7th arrondissement of Paris. The year was 1982, and spring had come early that year. Cherry blossoms painted the boulevards in soft pink, their petals falling gently onto the shoulders of passers-by like nature's own confetti. The Seine sparkled under the forgiving warmth of an April sun, and the air smelled faintly of blooming jasmine and freshly baked bread. And it was on this particular afternoon, as children laughed and chased each other along the stone pathways near the Jardin des Plantes, that a most peculiar encounter took place. Her name was Madeleine Fournier, though most people simply called her Meme Mado. She was 83 years old, sharp as a tailor's needle, and twice as quick with her wit. Her life had stretched across 2 world wars, a dozen political revolutions, and more than a few personal ones of her own making. She had worked as a seamstress in her youth, stitched uniforms during the wars, and tailored dreams for women who wanted to feel powerful long before it was fashionable to do so. And on this particular day, Meme Mado had decided quite unapologetically that her old bones deserved both style and comfort. She had pulled from her modest armoire a pair of finely pressed navy blue trousers tailored just the way she liked them, with pleats sharp enough to cut through a conversation, and hems that fell perfectly over her polished leather shoes. She wrapped a silk scarf around her neck, perched a soft felt beret atop her neatly pinned white curls, and set out for her afternoon stroll, her cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement, more out of habit than necessity. It was along Rue de la Montagne Sainte-Geneviève that she encountered him. A young officer freshly minted his uniform, still crisp and unwrinkled by the years, stood at the corner, adjusting his cap with a seriousness far too large for his youthful face. As Meme Mado approached, his gaze settled on her trousers, his brow furrowed. For a brief moment, the weight of forgotten laws and dusty regulations seemed to land squarely on his narrow shoulders. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a lecture from the academy surfaced something about maintaining public order, about long-forgotten decrees. And so, more out of nervous duty than genuine conviction, he stepped forward. "Madame," he began, his voice faltering as he attempted to muster the authority he clearly didn't yet feel. "I must remind you that it is technically prohibited for women to..." He glanced down as if the trousers themselves might complete the sentence for him. "To wear trousers in public without authorization." For a heartbeat, the street seemed to fall silent. Children paused mid-chase. A nearby pigeon flapped noisily from its perch. And then, Meme Mado threw back her head and laughed. Not a polite, grandmotherly giggle, but a full-bodied, joyous laugh that echoed off the stone walls and into the wide Parisian sky. She leaned slightly on her cane eyes, twinkling with mischief, and looked the young officer square in the eye. "My dear boy," she said, her voice warm and rich, like aged wine. "Do you know what I was doing when that law was written?" The officer blinked entirely at a loss. "Neither do I," she continued, "because it was over 180 years ago, and I wasn't born yet. But I can assure you my legs have earned the right to dress however they please." The poor young man flushed a deep shade of red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish caught in the wrong current. Meme Mado took a slow step closer, her cane tapping gently against his polished boot. "You know, young man," she smiled, "when you've lived long enough, you'll find that the most ridiculous laws are often the ones that stay longest on the books. But the world moves on anyway." She turned then her scarf, catching a playful breeze, and continued her walk down the avenue, each step as proud and unhurried as if she were leading a grand parade. Behind her, the young officer stood rooted in place, his cap now slightly askew, wondering if he had just experienced a lesson, or perhaps a gentle act of rebellion in its finest form. And so, dear listener, it was said that Meme Mado became something of a local legend after that day. Her afternoon strolls continued her trousers as sharp as ever her spirit, as unbreakable as the city she called home. And if you wandered through the same streets some months later, you might have noticed that young officer too, standing at his post, but with a little less tension in his shoulders and a faint knowing smile when a woman in trousers passed by. He never stopped them again, for though the law still sat gathering dust in some forgotten drawer, Paris had long since chosen its side, and with every confident step, Mémé Mado took, beneath the soft golden light of the Parisian sun, that old law crumbled a little more, not by force, but by the most powerful act of all, a quiet, joyful refusal to take it seriously. For 213 years, the law sat quietly forgotten, but unburdened by time. Like a book misplaced on the highest shelf of a grand library, it collected the dust of changing seasons, survived revolutions and wars, and remained untouched through fashion trends that rose and fell like the tides of the Seine. And yet, it was still there, that fragile decree from 1799, drafted in the uncertain days after the French Revolution, which declared that women of Paris must not wear trousers without formal permission from the police prefecture. In a city that had long crowned itself the capital of liberty, where the words liberté, égalité, fraternité adorned public buildings and echoed through every historical triumph, the law remained. It had become something of an urban legend by the early 2000s, a charming relic, a trivia question over coffee, or a passing joke between students strolling the left bank. Did you know, technically, I'm breaking the law right now, a young woman might say with a playful smile, tugging at the cuffs of her sleek black trousers, and yet beneath the humor, there remained something faintly unsettling about it. Because even if the law was absurd, especially because it was absurd, its very existence whispered that sometimes history's most ridiculous chains are the hardest to break, until at last someone stood up and asked the simplest, most overdue question. Why does this still exist? Her name was Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, a woman who embodied the very spirit of modern France, young, brilliant, and unafraid to question the dustiest corners of tradition. In 2013, she served as France's Minister of Women's Rights, and while her portfolio was filled with grand initiatives and serious reforms, she stumbled across this old peculiar law almost by accident. A footnote in an old report, a line item in a forgotten policy document. And like any woman who had ever tried to walk freely through a world built to contain her, she found that footnote both laughable and intolerable. Enough, she said simply. With the stroke of a pen on a winter's day in January 2013, the law was officially and formally repealed. After 213 years, the city of Paris finally officially let go. The newspapers reported it with a mixture of amusement and bemusement. Paris women are free to wear trousers at last, the headlines teased. But the truth was, Parisian women had never waited for permission. They had been wearing their trousers proudly through every season, every decade, every silent revolution that paved the way for this moment. The repeal didn't change their lives, but it did at long last clear the final cobweb from the attic of outdated laws. And there was a certain poetry to the moment, because when the final signature was placed on the official document, the woman holding the pen, Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, stood not in a skirt or a symbolically feminine dress, but in a beautifully tailored gray pantsuit. Sharp, elegant, comfortable. The very image of a woman who understood that power is not defined by what you wear, but by the quiet certainty with which you stand. And perhaps somewhere in the quiet streets of the city, an old woman named Meme Mado, if she were still taking her afternoon strolls, would have paused just long enough to smile, adjust her scarf, and say under her breath, "Well, it's about time." And so Paris moved forward as it always does, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with the soft, steady footsteps of women walking freely beneath the city's timeless skies, their trousers swaying gently with each confident stride. The law was gone, and with it, one of the last ridiculous echoes of a world that once tried so very hard to keep them small. It's a curious thing, isn't it? How a piece of fabric, two simple lengths of cloth stitched together, can become so much more than clothing. A uniform can command respect. A veil can spark endless debate. A hat tilted just so can declare defiance without a single word spoken. And for the women of Paris, the trouser, once outlawed, once hidden, once scandalous, had quietly become something far more powerful than fashion. It had become a symbol of freedom, not the loud fist in the air kind of freedom that makes headlines and history books. No, this was a gentler sort of revolution, one born not from protests in the streets, but from small personal choices made in front of bedroom mirrors and shop windows. The freedom to rise in the morning and ask not, "What am I expected to wear today?" but instead, "What do I choose to wear today?" A freedom so subtle that it slipped beneath the notice of those who had long dictated how a woman should present herself to the world. And perhaps that's the most dangerous kind of freedom, the kind that arrives quietly and settles in making itself at home in a woman's daily life until it is no longer questioned, only lived. By the 21st century, the streets of Paris reflected this transformation with effortless grace. On any given day, you might see it play out along the Rue Saint-Honoré, a woman in a sharp, tailored suit, striding confidently past the windows of luxury boutiques, her heels clicking out a quiet rhythm of certainty, or along the sunlit paths of the Luxembourg Gardens, where a young mother sat cross-legged on the grass in a pair of comfortable linen trousers, reading poetry aloud to her wide-eyed daughter. Even beneath the towering arches of Notre Dame, amid the slow procession of tourists, you'd find women in flowing silk pants, their movements as graceful and unconstrained as the breeze that curled through the ancient stone corridors. The trouser had lost its scandal, and in losing that, it had gained something far more valuable: normalcy. It no longer needed to shout its presence. It no longer served as a symbol of rebellion. It simply belonged. And isn't that the final quiet victory of every hard-fought freedom? When the battle is over, and what was once forbidden becomes so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it simply folds into the fabric of daily life. It's easy to forget now how much weight those first hidden trousers carried under heavy skirts, how much courage it took for women to step out into the cold streets wearing their brothers' woolen pants, their fathers' work trousers, their husbands' cast-offs, anything that could shield them from the bite of winter and the sharper sting of public judgment. Or how with every careful stride they tested the strength of invisible walls built by centuries of quiet oppression. And yet as they walked one step then another, those walls began to crumble. Not all at once, not loudly, but slowly, brick by brick, hemline by hemline. And with each generation, the question changed. From are we allowed to can we? To finally, why wouldn't we? And perhaps that is how most true revolutions end. Not with a bang, but with a collective shrug and the beautiful realization that what was once forbidden has become at last perfectly unremarkable. Today, if you wander the winding alleys of Le Marais or the broad boulevards of Haussmann's Paris, you'll see it everywhere. Freedom walking quietly in wide-legged trousers and crisp jeans in tailored suits and flowing palazzo pants. And no one looks twice. That, dear listener, is the quiet triumph. Because the greatest freedoms are not always those carved in stone or declared in grand speeches. Sometimes they are sewn gently into fabric, worn lightly across the years, and carried forward not with the roar of rebellion, but with the soft, confident sound of footsteps on ancient cobblestones. History likes to remember its heroes in bold strokes, statues in grand squares, names etched onto marble plaques, faces immortalized in faded portraits. But in Paris, if you listen closely, if you walk the quieter streets and sit a little longer in the forgotten corners of old cafes, you'll find that the most remarkable stories were never written in books or displayed in galleries. They are the whispered legends of women whose names history did not bother to record, but whose footsteps left soft imprints on the very fabric of this city. And oh, what stories they left behind. In a tiny alley just off Rue des Rosiers, there once stood a modest tailor's shop with no sign above the door. Its windows were always half draped with thin linen curtains, and most who passed by thought it long abandoned. But if you were one of the few who knew, and you knocked gently 3 times, with just the right rhythm, the door would creak open, and you'd find Madame Estelle sitting behind an ancient Singer sewing machine. She was well into her 60s then, her hair a soft silver cloud pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Her fingers were worn thin from decades of stitching, but her eyes held the sparkle of a woman who had known secrets. It was said that during the harsh winters of the 1920s, when the law against women wearing trousers was still technically in place, Madame Estelle made custom garments for women who refused to suffer the cold in silence. She called them les pantalons invisibles, invisible trousers, tailored to be worn comfortably beneath skirts, made from the softest wools and silks she could acquire. They were crafted with such skill that no one would suspect a thing unless they knew exactly what to look for. Her clients included shop girls and baronesses, alike women from every corner of society, all bound by the same quiet desire to walk freely to stay warm, and to push back, however gently, against the absurdity of their time. Madame Estelle never advertised. She didn't need to. Her reputation moved through Paris like smoke through a narrow chimney rising quietly, curling into the hidden spaces where women gathered over tea and shared the small rebellions of their lives. Some say that, tucked in the lining of each garment, she stitched a tiny message in thread almost invisible to the eye. Restez fiers. Stay proud. And perhaps somewhere in the cedar-lined trunks of old Parisian attics, those garments still remain forgotten pieces of a forgotten resistance, their stitches holding not just fabric, but fragments of freedom. And there were others, in the dimly lit corners of Le Chat Noir, The famous Montmartre cabaret dancers would gather after performances, pulling off their feathered headdresses and sequined bodices, and slip into loose trousers garments far more comfortable than their dazzling stage costumes. For a few precious hours before dawn, behind closed doors, they lived exactly as they pleased. There's an old black and white photograph, rarely seen beyond a few private collections, of 5 such women seated on the back steps of the club. Their faces are flushed from laughter, cigarettes dangling carelessly from their fingers, trousered legs crossed, as if they had sat like that their entire lives, utterly at ease, utterly unafraid. No captions, no headlines, just a moment captured forever when the world's rules fell away and freedom tasted like tobacco smoke and the cool stone beneath their feet. And who could forget the story of Geneviève Moreau, a tram operator during the Second World War? When Paris fell under occupation and the city's heartbeat slowed to a fearful murmur, Geneviève pulled on a pair of sturdy canvas trousers, buttoned her uniform jacket, and took her place behind the controls of Tram Line 6. She guided that tram through silent streets and bombed-out avenues, her presence a quiet declaration that life, ordinary, stubborn, beautiful life, would go on. She never asked for permission. She simply did what needed to be done. And isn't that the most Parisian thing of all? To find freedom not just in grand gestures, but in the simple, everyday decision to live fully and unapologetically, even when no one is watching. So if you ever find yourself wandering Paris after the tourists have gone, when the streets are hushed, and the Seine flows dark and slow beneath the bridges, pause for a moment. Look at the worn stone steps tucked between the buildings. Run your fingers along the faded carvings on old wooden doors. And listen, you might just hear them, the faint echoes of laughter behind shuttered windows, the rustle of silk hidden beneath wool, the soft, confident footsteps of women who changed the world, not by demanding it, but by quietly claiming their place within it. One hidden stitch, one careful stride, one pair of perfectly tailored trousers at a time. If you walk in Paris today beneath the same grand boulevards, across the same worn cobblestones, under the same flickering lamplights that once illuminated a city both burdened and blessed by its history, you might miss the quiet revolutions that unfolded here. The streets do not shout their past. They hum it gently. And if you're willing to slow down just for a moment, you'll feel it in the rhythm of passing footsteps, in the soft sway of fabric against stone, in the quiet confidence that lingers in the air, like the faintest trace of perfume, long after the wearer has gone. Walk along the Rue Saint-Honoré on a clear afternoon, and you'll see it. A woman strides past the windows of the finest fashion houses, her heels clicking with assurance, her wide-legged trousers catching the breeze like a banner of effortless freedom. No one stares, no one whispers, because here now, such a sight is as natural as the turning of the seasons, as expected, as the blossoming of chestnut trees along the avenues come spring. Cross over to the left bank, where students lounge on the stone steps of the Sorbonne, books open on their laps, laughter rising in soft bursts under the late morning sun. Among them, young women sit comfortably in loose linen pants, their legs crossed easily. Their conversation ranging from art and philosophy to politics and dreams, too big to fit into the cramped confines of the past. And if you wander a little farther into the winding alleys of Le Marais, where the air still carries the scent of fresh bread and old secrets, you might catch a glimpse of something that feels almost like a memory. A grandmother, her silver hair gathered neatly beneath a soft beret, walking hand in hand with her granddaughter. The child skips ahead, her tiny legs wrapped in the softest cotton trousers, her laughter ringing off the ancient walls. The grandmother follows at her own pace, her tailored pants pressed just so her cane tapping out a slow, familiar rhythm against the pavement. And perhaps if you look closely enough, you might see it a faint smile curling at the edges of her lips as she watches the child dance ahead. A smile that knows exactly how far they've come, because every confident step that young girl takes is a step made possible by centuries of quieter ones, steps taken by women who walked before her when walking freely was itself an act of defiance. And so Paris lives on. It does not erase its history. It wears it like a favorite coat, worn at the edges, a little frayed in places, but still wrapped tightly around its shoulders, carrying the warmth of every season it has endured. The laws have changed. The world has changed. And yet the spirit of those early footsteps remains etched invisibly into every stone and echoed in every free, unhurried stride. So if you walk in Paris today, don't rush. Let your steps fall in time with the city's heartbeat. Listen to the way the wind moves through the narrow streets, brushing gently against cafe awnings, and dancing through the lace curtains of open windows. And as you wander, remember this: freedom does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes softly on well-worn soles and through streets too old to care for scandal anymore. It comes in the quiet choice of what to wear, where to go, and how to simply be without permission, without apology. And if you close your eyes just for a moment, you might almost hear them. The footsteps of those who walked before, stitching their quiet rebellions into the fabric of this city. One step, one choice, one perfectly ordinary and yet entirely extraordinary day at a time. And so, dear listener, we find ourselves back where we began, beneath the soft golden glow of Parisian lamplight, the cobbled streets stretching quietly into the night, and the gentle hush of a city that has witnessed more revolutions than it cares to count. But tonight, there are no banners unfurled, no barricades built from overturned carts, no fiery speeches shouted from balconies into the restless air. No, this revolution, perhaps the most enduring of them all, came not with noise but with grace. It arrived in the measured sound of footsteps, in the swish of fabric against stone, in the quiet certainty of a woman choosing, at long last, to dress not for the expectations of others, but for herself. History loves its grand moments: the fall of kings, the rise of nations, the flash of cameras as signatures are inked onto treaties that promise a new dawn. But the most profound changes rarely announce themselves. They move gently through the world, soft as a sigh, patient as the passage of time. They begin in small, almost invisible acts. A woman in 1799, pulling her brother's worn trousers over trembling legs before stepping out into the frozen street. A seamstress in a hidden corner of the city, stitching courage into the hems of garments never meant to be seen. An actress striding down the Champs-Élysées, her tailored trousers cutting through the fabric of polite society with every confident step. And thousands upon thousands of women after them. Teachers and factory workers, mothers and daughters, dancers and doctors, all carrying forward that quiet revolution one morning at a time, standing before their mirrors and asking the simplest, most powerful question: what do I choose today? It was never just about clothing. It was about space, about freedom, about the unspoken right to move through the world, unencumbered legs, free to stride backs, held straight eyes, meeting the horizon without hesitation. And as the years rolled on, that freedom stopped being a fight. It became natural, expected, so common in fact that few remember now how rare, how radical it once was. But perhaps that is the final victory of any true revolution. When the extraordinary becomes ordinary, when the right to choose to walk, to wear, to be, is no longer questioned, but simply lived. And if you find yourself in Paris one quiet evening, walking those winding streets where the echoes of history linger like the last notes of a forgotten song, pause for a moment. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Breathe in the air that has carried the hopes and defiance of generations. And remember, while the world often measures progress in loud moments and breaking news, the truest revolutions are sometimes measured in nothing more than a quiet, steady heartbeat and the soft, determined sound of footsteps moving forever forward. Thank you for walking this journey with me. May your own steps, wherever they take you, always carry the quiet strength of those who walked before. Bonne nuit and sweet dreams.